At 7:23 in the morning on a Thursday in late October, I was on my hands and knees in the mechanical room of a four-story office building on King Street, trying to figure out why the boiler pressure kept bleeding off overnight. The floor smelled like rust and old pipe dope. My flashlight was dying. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down in fat, wet flakes, and somewhere upstairs, 140 people were about to arrive expecting the heat to work. I've been the chief operations manager at Meridian Financial Group for 19 years. 19 years of early mornings, late nights, and the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't fit in a manual or a spreadsheet. I knew which elevator stuck on the third floor if you let the doors close too fast. I knew the cleaning crew left at 4:30, but the lead, a quiet man I'll call my nightside contact, always stayed until 5 to make sure the executive floor looked right. I knew the backup generator needed its oil changed every 800 hours, not the 1200 the manufacturer claimed, because our winters here in southwestern Ontario put a different kind of load on that machine. I had no idea that morning that I had roughly 2 hours before everything I'd built over 19 years would be handed back to me in a manila envelope. My name is Arthur Flemming. Artie to the people who knew me before the gray hair. I'm 54 years old. I started at Meridian when it was a mid-sized investment firm with 3 floors, a receptionist named whatever her name was who made the best coffee I've ever tasted, and a founder who believed that the people who kept the lights on deserved to know the founder's name. I knew his name. He knew mine. We shook hands on my first day, and he said, "Arthur, I need someone who treats this building like it's his own house." I said I could do that. I meant it more than he probably expected. The founder retired in 2014. Sold the firm to a private equity group out of Toronto. After that, the offices started filling up with a different kind of person. People with expensive haircuts and the kind of confidence that comes from never having fixed anything with their hands. My direct superior became a man I'll call my director. He was brought in from Vancouver. Good-looking guy, mid-40s, wore slim-cut suits that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. Not a bad person. Just someone who had never once thought about where the hot water came from. He managed me the way people manage things they don't understand, from a distance, with a lot of CC'd emails. Above him was the chief operating officer, a woman who arrived 2 years after the acquisition and immediately started talking about streamlining infrastructure. I figured out pretty quickly that streamlining infrastructure meant getting rid of people like me and replacing us with outsourced contracts that looked cheaper on a quarterly report. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what nobody thought to look into. When Meridian moved into the King Street building back in 2005, we were expanding fast, and the commercial real estate market was brutal. The building's owner at the time, a retired developer who I'd known casually through a mutual connection, needed a reliable long-term tenant. The firm's corporate credit at that point wasn't strong enough to satisfy his requirements. I'd been there 3 years by then, had good credit, solid income, a track record. So I did what made sense at the time. I signed the lease, not on behalf of the company, in my name, with my credit, my signature, my personal guarantee. The plan was always to transfer it to the firm once they got their financial footing under them. That was the conversation I had with the founder over a coffee at Tim Hortons one Tuesday morning in March of 2005. He shook my hand, said he'd have legal sorted out within the year. Legal never sorted it out, and every year after that, when the renewal came up, it came to me. I handled it the way I handled everything else in that building, quietly, completely, without making a big deal about it. The property manager knew me by first name. The building owner's son, who took over when his father passed, would call me directly if there was ever a question. Not the firm's legal team, not their CFO, me, Arthur Flemming, in whose name the lease still sat 19 years later because nobody had ever thought to ask. That Thursday morning, I fixed a boiler. Took me 40 minutes. Bad pressure relief valve, had a spare in the storage room because I'd dealt with that same valve on that same model in 2018, and I'd learned my lesson. By the time the first employees were coming through the front doors shaking snow off their coats, the heat was running fine. Nobody knew there'd been a problem. That was the job. Make the problems invisible before they became problems. At 9:10, my director sent me a calendar invite with a 15-minute window at 11. Subject line: quick check-in. No agenda. No context. I've worked around enough corporations to know what a vague calendar invite from HR at 11 o'clock on a Thursday means. I went back to my desk, drank the rest of my coffee, and started thinking very clearly about a particular filing cabinet in my home office. The meeting was in the small boardroom on the second floor, the one with the frosted glass walls that everyone calls the fishbowl. My director was there. Beside him, the head of HR, a woman who had joined the firm about 18 months earlier from a consulting background. Sharp, professional, and utterly committed to whatever process she was running. She had a folder. There's always a folder. Arthur, thank you for coming in, my director started. He looked uncomfortable, which I appreciated. At least he had the decency to look uncomfortable. The HR lead did most of the talking after that. Words like restructuring, role elimination, operational efficiency. She'd clearly done this before. She was calm, organized, and about as warm as the boiler had been at 7 that morning. They were eliminating my position. Effective immediately. Outsourcing facilities management to a national property services company out of Mississauga. The severance package was 3 months' pay, continuation of benefits until the end of February, and a standard non-disclosure agreement. The letter was in the folder. They slid it across the table. I looked at my name on the letter. Arthur M. Flemming. At least they spelled it right. I didn't say much. I asked a few questions, procedural ones, about the transition timeline and what they wanted done with my office contents. My director kept looking at a spot on the table. The HR lead answered everything clearly and professionally. She was doing her job. Near the end, she asked me to return my security badge, my parking pass, and any keys or access cards to company property. I reached into my jacket pocket, set my badge on the table, set my parking pass beside it. Then I set down my key ring. It had 11 keys on it, every one of them labeled in my handwriting. Master exterior, boiler room, server closet, roof access. Each one a little piece of institutional knowledge that lived in my head and in that ring and nowhere else in this building. I looked at my director. Is that everything you need from me today? He nodded. Couldn't quite meet my eyes. I stood up, pulled on my coat. There's a pressure relief valve on the east boiler that'll need replacing again in about 18 months, I said. The part number is on a sticker inside the storage room cabinet, second shelf from the top. Good luck. I walked out through the lobby. The snow had gotten heavier. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for about 10 minutes, not really going anywhere in my head. Then I drove to my brother-in-law's office. My brother-in-law is a commercial real estate lawyer, has been for 26 years. He has an office in a converted Victorian on Dundas Street with hardwood floors and one of those old cast-iron radiators that bangs and pops all winter. And every time I visit, I think about how I could fix that in an afternoon. He was between clients when I showed up. His assistant waved me through. I sat down across from his desk and told him what had happened. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "And the lease?" "Still in my name," I said. "Renewed last February. 5-year term." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked whether the firm had given me any formal notice of their intention to terminate their occupancy. They hadn't said a word about the lease. Not once. In 19 years, and not once in the last 3 hours. My brother-in-law picked up a pen, tapped it twice on his desk. "You know what this means?" I did. I'd been thinking about it since the folder came across the table. Here's the thing about a commercial lease in Ontario. When the named lessee is an individual, not a corporation, that individual holds the contractual relationship with the landlord. The company occupying the space is essentially operating under my permission through an arrangement that had never been formally papered over. And when that individual is terminated without any discussion of the lease, without any transition plan, without any legal transfer of the tenancy, that individual still has standing. Full standing. I went home, made a sandwich I didn't really taste. Then I went to my home office and opened the filing cabinet in the corner, the one that also holds my father's immigration papers from 1971, my kids' old report cards, and the original deed to the house. Third drawer down. The lease was in a red folder. 19 years of renewals, all of them in my name. The most recent amendment, signed February of this year, updated the rate and extended the term to 2029. The occupancy was listed as Meridian Financial Group, Arthur Flemming, lessee of record. I read through it slowly. Then I called my brother-in-law back. He came over that evening with a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Red and his reading glasses. We sat at the kitchen table while my wife made tea in the next room and occasionally looked through the doorway with an expression I can only describe as cautious satisfaction. She'd been telling me for 3 years that the new management didn't deserve me. She's usually right about these things. I've learned to accept that. My brother-in-law read through the lease the way lawyers read things, slowly, going back, cross-referencing. After about 40 minutes, he set it down and folded his glasses. He said, "You're not just on this lease, Artie. You are this lease." We talked through the options for a long time. I want to be honest about what was in my head during those conversations. It wasn't rage exactly. It was something more settled than that. 19 years of being the invisible infrastructure. 19 years of fixing things before anyone knew they were broken. 19 years of signing renewals and managing property relationships and making sure the heat worked and the elevators ran and the server room stayed cool. And then a 15-minute meeting with a folder and a parking pass handoff. They didn't ask me about the lease because it never occurred to them that someone like me might have that kind of standing. That was the assumption that cost them everything. I slept better that night than I had in months. 2 weeks later, my brother-in-law filed a formal notice of lease termination with the property manager. The owner's son, who I'd known for 12 years, who received the paperwork and immediately called me to make sure he understood what he was looking at. "Arthur," he said, "you're terminating the tenancy?" "I am," I said. "I have a replacement tenant lined up. They'll take the full 4 floors." The replacement tenant was a national accounting and advisory firm that had been quietly looking for Class B office space downtown for the better part of a year. I'd heard about it from a contact of mine, someone I'd done a favor for 6 years ago involving a water main and a very bad Friday afternoon. He'd kept my number. When I called him, he'd been expecting it. They were prepared to pay market rate, which, given what had happened to commercial real estate since 2005, was considerably more than what Meridian had been paying on a lease that had never been properly adjusted to reflect the actual value of the property. The property manager processed the paperwork. Notices were sent to the firm's registered business address by registered mail and email. A 60-day vacate timeline per the lease terms. Meridian's legal team received the documents on a Tuesday. I know this because my brother-in-law was CC'd on the confirmation. Apparently, the firm's response internally was something in the range of disbelief, followed by a very intensive 2-day scramble to understand how their lessee of record was a man who was no longer an employee. The answer, of course, was that nobody had ever asked. Not when they acquired the firm. Not when they restructured. Not when they hired the outsourced facilities company. Nobody had looked at the commercial lease for a building that housed their entire regional operation and thought to check whose name was on it. The COO called me on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in my garage at the time, going through my toolbox, a snap-on chest my wife got me for our 20th anniversary because she knows me well enough to know that's a real gift. I let it ring 3 times. Picked up on the 4th. She didn't waste time. She said my name and then, "Arthur, I think we need to talk about what's happening." I said, "I think we needed to talk about a lot of things about 3 weeks ago." She said the firm was prepared to negotiate, that they understood there had been some failures of communication, that they wanted to find a resolution that worked for everyone. I told her the resolution was already in motion. The new tenant had signed a letter of intent. The property manager had his paperwork. The timeline was 60 days. She asked if I would consider extending that timeline. I thought about the boiler at 7 in the morning. I thought about 19 years of vague calendar invites and folders across tables and the way my director couldn't quite meet my eyes. I said, "I kept that building running for 19 years. I fixed things before you knew they were broken. I signed that lease when nobody else could, and I maintained it every year after that without ever once being asked, thanked, or even acknowledged for what it actually meant. And then you handed me a parking pass and asked for my keys. So no, I'm not going to extend the timeline." She was quiet for a moment. I said, "The building will be fine. The new tenant takes care of their space. I've already briefed the property manager on everything they need to know. Good luck with the transition." I ended the call, went back to sorting through my toolbox. The next 6 weeks were, by all accounts, I received secondhand through my brother-in-law and through my former colleague, who still worked there and who I'll call my former co-worker, fairly chaotic for Meridian. Finding suitable office space for 140 people on 60 days' notice in a tight commercial market is genuinely difficult. They ended up splitting operations between a temporary shared workspace facility in the West End and a leased floor in a building about 4 blocks away that was only marginally suited to their needs. The outsourced facilities company they'd replaced me with, I was told, had a very rough introduction to the new space. Things broke. Response times weren't what they should have been. Apparently, the server room cooling had some issues in the first month. I heard about all of this the same way I heard most things, from the people who mattered, slowly, without any particular need to hurry. My former coworker, a facilities technician who'd worked under me for 11 years, called me about 3 weeks after the move and said he'd handed in his notice. Said he wasn't interested in working for a company that would do what they'd done. I told him he was making the right call for the right reasons and that I'd be happy to be a reference. He asked what I was doing. I looked around my home office, at the 2 contracts on my desk and the third one I was reviewing that afternoon. All of them from building owners in the region who'd heard, through the particular grapevine that exists in commercial property management, about a facilities manager with 19 years of hands-on experience who was now available. I told him I was doing exactly what I'd always done, just choosing who I did it for. By spring, I had 4 consulting agreements, setting my own hours. The billing rate was higher than my salary had ever been at Meridian. Every contract I signed, I had my brother-in-law review. Every clause, every renewal condition, every name on every page. Mine is always spelled correctly. I made that a condition. There's a moment I keep coming back to. It was a Tuesday in early April, a few months after everything settled. I drove past the King Street building on my way to a site visit. It was a clear day, that specific kind of clear you only get in southern Ontario when the winter finally releases its grip and the light comes back at a different angle. The new tenant's branding was already on the lobby directory. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Same brick, same entrance, same boiler room I'd spent countless mornings in, same elevator that sticks a little on the 3rd floor if you let the doors close too fast. Some things I told the new property manager when I introduced myself. Some things I kept. My wife asked me that evening if I felt like I'd gotten what I was after. I thought about it for a while. She's the kind of person who waits while you think, which is one of the many reasons I've been grateful for her every day for 26 years. I said, I don't think I was after anything exactly. I think I just stopped absorbing something I'd been absorbing for a long time. She thought about that. Then she said, Good. My daughter called me the next morning to ask how things were going. She works in human resources herself, which has led to some interesting dinner conversations over the years. I told her about the consulting work. She asked if I was happy. I said I was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. She said that sounded like an answer. In my garage, on the wall beside my workbench, I have 3 things. A photograph of my father the year he got his Canadian citizenship, standing outside the federal building in a suit he'd borrowed from a neighbor. A framed copy of my first pay stub from Meridian, April 2004, which I kept as a reminder of where things started. And a small brass hook I put up last November, the kind you find at any Canadian Tire for about $2. On that hook is the original key to the King Street building, the one the founder handed me in 2005 when I signed the lease. A worn, heavy commercial key with my initials scratched into the bow in my own handwriting, from a night when I was alone in the building late and had a marker and too much time to think. I didn't keep it as a souvenir of what I lost. I kept it as evidence of what I built. The work was always real. The building was always standing on something. They just forgot for a while what that something was. I reminded them